Catherine Salmon, birth order. Bienvenida, please.
Thank you. So I'm here today to convince all of you and the jury that birth order is very important to our development in terms of a number of different things. It's important in terms of shaping our personality, and it's important in shaping our relationships with others and the behaviors that we exhibit as adults as well. So one question I have for you is, do you think that people actually do believe that birth order plays a role, that birth order influences people's personalities? Do you think that firstborns have certain traits, for example? And people have done a variety of different studies to try and look at this, to see what people actually do generally think. And in fact, there are a number of different stereotypes, if you'd like to call them that people have about birth order. So these are studies where people ask, well, what do you think are traits that represent firstborns? What are traits that best represent middle children or best represent the baby of the family? And what you generally see is that firstborns get a lot of really positive traits. They're considered to be favored and indulged by parents, ambitious, conscientious. The baby of the family is often seen as very friendly and outgoing, somewhat indulged by their parents. Middleborns are also seen as very outgoing, but they're also often considered to be neglected. And in fact, they're the only birth order that does not get called spoiled. Everybody else gets spoiled, but not the middle children. And so one question is, are these perceptions accurate? Are there any truth to these perceptions? So it raises the question about how our birth order influences who we are. And the question of, why do kids from the same families turn out so differently? So you can think about you and your siblings. Are you really that much alike, or in fact, you're very different? My brother and I are an excellent example of this. We grew up in the same family. We grew up in the same home with parents that were actually quite indulgent in some ways of both of us. But we turned out to be very different. My PhD is in psychology. His PhD is in engineering. He's interested in mechanical things. I am incompetent with the mechanical things, and I'm much more interested in living things. And our personalities are very different, and I hope to convince you that part of the differences in our personalities are really due to the fact that my brother is a firstborn and took on that role, and that I was a baby of the family and took on that role. What this slide is also pointing out to you is that there are really two factors about the family that are important in terms of birth order effects: differential parental investment and what we call sibling competition or sibling niches. And just to briefly tell you what these things are, differential parental investment simply means that parents invest differently in their children, not always the same amount, sometimes by choice and sometimes just by circumstance. Okay. What this means is that often firstborns who actually get a certain portion of parental investment with no other children around, they're the first on the scene, tend to get a lot of expectations on the part of the parents in terms of what they'll achieve, but they also get a lot of time and investment, both in terms of attention, but also in terms sometimes of financial investment. Lastborns also sometimes get an advantage from this in terms of parental investment, in the sense that lastborns sometimes also have a period of time where they're the last child left at home, last chance for parents to invest, and so they may get a bump as well. On the other hand, middleborns always have to share the resources, always are stuck competing for resources, and so that may result in some differences where, in fact, middleborns lose out in terms of parental attention, and that may affect, and I certainly can present some results that suggest that that affects how they develop in terms of personality and the relationships with family and friends. Evidence that demonstrates how much, in some cases, differential parental investment actually occurs. This is just a study that demonstrates the amount of resources that parents invest towards children who are at college, showing that firstborns and lastborns get more money per month from their parents than the poor middle kids do. Also, middleborns and lastborns are underrepresented in universities in general. So those of us who do birth order research at universities have a hard time recruiting them because our universities are full of firstborn children trying to fulfill their parents' high expectations for them. And then there's also the role of sibling competition. And this is the fact that children are stuck there competing for their parents' resources. The first child comes on the scene. He's got that role of the parental favorite, getting all the resources with all the expectations. The other children actually have to be competing and changing and trying to be different from the first child in order to get access to those resources. And so the children that are closest to each other in birth spacing, the closest to each other in order, are often the ones that have the strongest competition between them, the most difficulty in getting along sometimes, and they're the ones that have that sort of conflict. And so what I want to point out is that this creates big differences in terms of personality. Okay? If you look at firstborns, you look at middle children, you look at lastborns, they're often more similar to each other than they are to their siblings in terms of some of these personality variables. With firstborns scoring high in conscientiousness, being the responsible one, and later-born children tending to score a little bit lower in that. With last-born and later-born children generally scoring higher in agreeableness, their way of dealing with conflict situations is to try and get along, negotiate for what they need. Whereas firstborns might try to impose their will more. They've been given the pseudo-parental role, and they take that to the extreme sometimes, enforcing their will in the same ways that parents sometimes do. In terms of extroversion, there are really two different aspects of it. The dominance aspect, firstborns are high in, laterborns are lower, but the laterborns score really high in terms of sociability. They're very outgoing, they like to interact with others, their peers. And then there's openness to experience. Openness to experience facilitates looking for new roles, looking for new niches, and in this sense, openness to experience is a later-born trait. Firstborns tend to be more likely to follow the rules, tend to be more conforming, more traditional. Radical revolutions, whether they be in science or politics, tend to be led by later-born children, not so much by firsts. Some of the behavioral areas where these things make a difference: family interactions, firstborns having more contact with their family, closer relationships, family being a bigger part of their sense of self-identity. They're more likely to be the family historian. And firstborns are more likely to give you better gifts. They give more expensive gifts to their family. If you look at middleborns as a group, they tend to have less close relationships to the family, but very close relationships often to their friends. And in fact, in the gift-giving study, where firstborns gave more to their family, middle children actually gave more to their friends, okay? Which raises the issue of later-born children, and maybe in particular middleborns, being, in a sense, friendship specialists, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. I also wanted to point this slide out here because politics have been in the news a lot lately, and one of the things that's interesting is that there's a lot of use of kin terminology in political speech. People say things like, "my brothers and sisters, join with me." And the question is this really effective? And so in this one study that I did, I looked at the effectiveness of using kin terms versus terms like my fellow citizens or my friends. And overall, in fact, kin terms are more effective in getting people to think that they're on the same side as the speechmaker. But there is an interaction with birth order such that middle children actually are less likely to be convinced by the speechmaker who uses terms of kinship to try and elicit their support, and they're more likely to agree with the speechmaker who uses terms that relate to friendship. Okay, again, coming back to this idea that they may be friend specialists. Another piece of evidence that is connected to this is that all laterborns tend to score high in terms of peer popularity, but when you look at things like how important is friendship to you, what would you do for your friends, how much support do you get from your friends, middle children seem to score higher on this measure. They tend to worry more about being seen as a good friend. They tend to value their friendships somewhat more. And for those of you who were at Paul Zach's talk earlier in the conference, he talked about the investment game and the idea if you give people oxytocin that makes them more trusting and more altruistic. If you ask children or ask college students to play the investment game, and you keep track of their birth order, what you find is that later-born children are more trusting in that game. They're more willing to give money to the other person, and they're also more willing to give money back to the other person. So there's more cooperation, more trust going on there as well in terms of birth order differences. And then a last little topic I wanted to briefly mention are sexual relationships, something all of us tend to be very interested in. There are some studies that suggest that birth order may influence people's romantic love styles. There are some studies that have been done in the past that suggest that middle children, in fact, have higher, they and their partners have higher levels of marital satisfaction. And this slide here shows a figure from a study that I did a number of years ago that asked people about their infidelity in their sexual relationships. And in fact, what I found was that if you ask people, when you're in a romantic, monogamous relationship, have you ever cheated on your partner, that in fact you see the baby of the family to be the most likely to have actually cheated, firstborns to be in the middle, and the baby and the middleborns to actually be the least likely to have cheated. And that may again be a reflection of how important a role they place on social relationships and keeping them as a source of support, because they haven't historically gotten as much attention, investment from their parents. They attend so much to those relationships then outside the family. In the minute I have left, I want to briefly mention some factors that influence how typical birth order can be. So these are things that influence how likely someone is to prototypically fit the birth order model. And one is that birth spacing can play a role. If there's a really big interval, there's less competition. Some parents have a really strong gender preference, and so they may be more likely to favor boys than girls, regardless of where they fall in the family order. And so even if the middle of the family is the only boy, he may be really the firstborn in terms of parental expectations and parental investment. And the other two factors are really very similar in some ways. Death or disability of an older sibling. Again, parental expectations may change, and what happens during step and remarriage, where people's birth order often gets shuffled. And of course, the age at which that takes place makes a difference. So, thank you very much.
Wow, muy bien también. Please, Catherine, thank you. Catherine, are you the oldest?
Baby of the family.
You're the baby of the family. So be careful with loyalty. No, I'm just kidding.